Everyone, I've just made you a quick 6 slide recap, a little bit of revision of the first language change booklet, which is the one that deals with history, because there's an awful lot in there, so I thought it would benefit to give you a bit of revision on it. So when we started the booklet, we talked about how language changes all the time. Okay, it changes constantly, and there's always reasons. It's not just random. Some of the common reasons for language change are these. So one of the main influences on English is immigration. Okay, so that's people arriving in England, which they have done, you know, from the kind of beginnings of the English language. Some of that immigration you might call invasion. So the Vikings, the Normans, you know, those were invasions. But, you know, in the 20th and 21st century, we've also had waves of much more sort of friendly, less invasive mass immigration. For instance, from the Caribbean, from Uganda, from Eastern Europe. Okay, there's also been emigration, so English has moved around the world. Again, you could call some of that emigration invasion. You know, the English have invaded other countries. And then just travel generally, whether that's real travel or kind of virtual travel. So once people started to travel around the world, they brought stuff back from other places they went to, and they brought the language with them. Some other influences on language change: new communication technology, so things like newspapers, books, TV, radio, cinema, and now the internet has had enormous influences on language change and also the spread of language change. Then there are social changes. So when there is social change, there's language change. So for instance, when more people started to become literate, so when education became more widespread and more people could read, there was lots of language change then. Things like politically correct language, where, you know, we try not to be racist or sexist, what you would now call maybe like woke language, has come about because of social change. And then there's cultural change, so trends in music, in film, online, and so on, that creates new language, and particularly online trends create new grammar as well as new words, as we'll see a little bit later in the course. Everything about language changes. So lexis, the words; grammar, that's all kinds of grammar, so word order, but also morphology, so word level grammar, you know, things like how you make a plural, how you make a tense. Pronunciation changes quite significantly as well. So we looked at how lexis changes, the way new words are created through various processes. So things like borrowing from other languages, blending, where you put a couple of words together, like brunch, breakfast and lunch. Semantic change, so you know, think about a word we've talked about, the word slut, you know, which once meant somebody who was a little bit messy and careless, and now has the kind of connotations of sexual promiscuity. Functional shift is where a word changes word class. Okay, so if we take something like the word Google, which started off as a proper noun and is now used as a verb. Grammar changes, and these are some of the common changes in grammar. So pronouns have changed quite a bit. We've lost some pronouns, and we've also changed the way we use pronouns. So we've lost thee, thou, ye, but we've changed the way we use pronouns. Even recently, you know, we've started using singular they as a gender neutral pronoun. Lots of preposition changes, so those little grammatical words like prepositions are most susceptible to change, so things like on, in, of, we've changed our use of those. The morphology of verb tenses, so we've lost the ETH ending, eth, for the first person present tense. We just use ing instead now. Plurals have changed in some cases. Comparatives and superlatives have changed. So things like we now say better instead of gooder, you know, and so on. Pronunciation, for instance, the Great Vowel Shift, which we'll talk about in a little while. And more recently, though, than the Great Vowel Shift, which is a Middle English thing, the spread of the glottal stop, glottal, where you do a stop in the back of your throat instead of a T sound, glottal. That's spread around lots and lots of accents in this country in the past 40 years or so. It was quite unusual, or quite contained until the 90s, quite contained in and around London, and now it's present in every area of the UK. So lots of pronunciation changes. So all kinds of language changes, you know, all aspects of language change. And I haven't even talked about spelling, you know, orthography, the way we write things down has also changed. Okay, quick potted history for you then, and it is a potted history. There's a video which I put on the team for you, which is a nice hour-long documentary about some of these things if you want a bit more, but this is your quick potted history of what we did in class. Remember, you only need to know in any detail about early modern English onwards, if you see what I mean. So early modern English to modern English, so from about 1700 onwards, but it's useful to have a bit of background of kind of older varieties of English. So what we call Old English is from about the year 500 to about the year 1100. So before 500 AD, England was populated by various tribes speaking lots of different languages, but they were all Celtic languages. Okay, so Celtic languages we still have. Welsh is Celtic, Scots Gaelic is Celtic, Irish Gaelic is Celtic. Okay, so Celtic languages still exist in Britain, but not in England. Unless I guess you count Cornish, which is, you know, lots of people are trying to save, but really no one is. It's a dead language. No one is a native speaker. When Germanic settlers arrived, so they're the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes coming from what is now Germany and Holland, they arrived in the 5th century, and their languages slowly evolved into Old English, and we basically lost all the Celtic influences on English in this period. In the 8th century, the Vikings invaded, and they also spoke Germanic languages. They were integrated into Old English, you know, so lots of Germanic influenced languages blending together, and English is basically a Germanic language with a few other influences. So it's on the same sort of branch as the language tree of the language tree as German. The Vikings were mostly successful in invading the north of England, and that's why there is a particular Viking influence up there on things like place names and family names, and also the accent, particularly in, you know, up towards the Scottish border. Then we got Middle English, which started when with the Norman invasion. Okay, so the Normans invaded in 1066. They spoke French, a variety of French. Okay, what you might call Old French. They took power, and so for a while, all the powerful people in the country, the kind of upper classes, were French and speaking French, and so French was the language of power, and English was the language of the lower classes, and that influence still persists in things like, you know, what we consider high register tends to be like Latin influenced and French influenced, and what we consider more sort of low register is a bit more kind of Old English influence. So if you take some synonyms, let's say ask is an English word, a Germanic influenced English word. Question is a French word, okay, and interrogate, which is much more official and kind of specialist register, that's a Latin word. So that kind of influence still persists. In food as well, the names of animals tend to be Old English. The names of the animal once they're cooked and on the table tend to be French, okay. So cow is English, beef is French influenced, okay, and that's because, you know, it was the English people doing the farming and the cooking, the French people doing the eating because they were the powerful ones. But gradually, as these things happen, always the two languages integrated. So we lost a lot of Old English lexis, but held on to a lot of the grammar. So about 85% of Old English words disappeared, and a lot of our lexis now is you know, French and Latin influence because of the Normans. We also had the great vowel shift, a pronunciation shift, where we changed the way we pronounce most of our vowels to be a little bit shorter, and it seems to be a result of language mixing somehow. You know, it was a result of the two languages, the Germanic and the French, kind of knocking the edges off each other, and the pronunciation kind of met in the middle. Okay, so here's where you need to start kind of knowing a little bit more about the language. With early modern English, kind of about 1700 onwards, you need to be thinking about knowing a bit more about it. But the early modern period started earlier than that. The start of it is usually counted when we first got the printing press, because once we got the printing press, we have talked a bit about this, we had to have a kind of standardized version of English, didn't we? Because otherwise, you know, how is a person in London going to read the same thing as a person in the Northwest? Okay. So that's when we got standardization, and that standard was from the sort of southeast corner of England, because that's where Caxton set up his printing press, right? That's where the only two universities were, Oxford and Cambridge, and it's where Parliament was and so on. So, you know, of course, not Parliament at that point, but you know, the royal court, the seat of power, that's where the power was, and the educated, and so that's where there was a demand for printed text. Okay. This period also encompasses the Renaissance, so huge amount of new lexis in the Renaissance because of all the travel and all the artistic movements and all the scientific discoveries. So a big explosion of new language, and this is the period where you know, we got Shakespeare and the King James Bible and so on. And then late modern English, what characterises late modern English? Well, standardisation and prescriptivism, you know, real moves towards fixing the language, and real movements towards being quite judgmental about right and wrong here. So the first dictionary, that was Samuel Johnson in 1755, and he was attempting to write this dictionary in order to fix the language, especially spelling, but also kind of meaning. And there were lots of grammar books in the same period, a huge explosion of grammar books, 500 grammar books published in 50 years. There was huge changes again in this period, much like in the Renaissance. So this time, due to, first of all, mass literacy, so, you know, in the 20th century, for the first time, most people could read, but also things like mass media, so the invention of newspapers, first of all, then radio and TV and film, and now the internet. Okay, so that's all led to rapid change. Okay, so what you can see from this first book is language is always changing, constantly. All aspects of language are changing, and there are always reasons for that change, okay? And there are patterns in the changes, so we tend to get more complex lexis, like more lexis every time, you know, something changes, but we tend to simplify grammar as languages mix together, okay? So those are the patterns. I hope that's helpful, all right, and it will help you move on to the next bit of language change.